So today we're going to talk about the technologies used during the Second World War. Some of them are developed during the Second World War. Many of them exist before, but they're going to be enhanced during the Second World War. Some will be born during, towards the end of the Second World War that will have a big impact on the later history that we'll talk about. So as we talk about these, I want you to think about a couple things. First, about those technologies that you learned about with regards to the First World War that may or may not have aided in victory. Things like machine gun and airplanes and tanks and such during the First World War, barbed wire. And then think about these technologies. Now we'll talk about the second, because IB likes questions that make you think about two wars in the 20th century and the technologies that are developed and how they have an impact ultimately on the outcome of the war. So we're just really going to run through a litany of these things that were developed or enhanced during the war that might have some part to play in the war being victorious for the Allies or ultimately a defeat for the Axis powers. Everyone good? Good. We're going to start with radar. Interesting, like what we see developed in the 1930s and employed in the Second World War still has a part to play in the Star Wars universe. This identical thing is like right on top of the Millennium Falcon, right? Yeah. So radar is harnessing radio waves, using radio waves to shoot them out into wherever, into the sky. And if they bounce off of something, they'll be bounced back to you. And they can be picked up in this dish, and then you can tell that something is on its way, or something is out there and it's moving. All right? Everybody had this radar technology before the war. But the Allies are going to create a lot of advancements with this technology. And this comes from another one of those areas where we have another example where the allies were better allies than the Axis allies. Remember we talked about Japan and Germany and Italy really being kind of out for themselves in a lot of respect, having their own motives in the war, whereas the Allied powers, especially Britain and the United States, really had a unified goal in mind. So in addition to those powers deciding at the Washington Conference early on in the war that they would have a Europe-first strategy and they'd focus on defeating Nazis, they also agreed to share technological advancements and technological research. So British and American researchers doing work with something like the radar and sharing that information is going to make both of them stronger, and it's going to make the development much more quicker and much more advanced than what the Germans or the Japanese are going to be able to do. What other advantage do you think the Americans and the British are going to have over their Axis counterparts when it comes to research and development? Yes?
All of the undesirable scientists that were from Germany go emigrate to Britain and then eventually America.
Okay, you get a lot of, in the 1930s, a lot of the most brilliant minds of Germany. Some of them Jewish, some of them just fed up with what Adolf Hitler was doing to their nation. Many of them leave Germany and end up in Britain and end up in the United States. This is going to be hugely important to the American nuclear program. Anyone else? Any other ideas why the British and the Americans in particular are going to have a unique advantage in technological development during the Second World War, like during the actual course of the war? Green Lantern?
I'm just thinking radar would have a limited range, right?
Of course.
So if there's only a certain perimeter around each radar station,
Sure.
They could coordinate, and British would, and if they did were any weak spots, the British could let Allies know, hey, there's a little weak spot here.
Okay, and try to fill in the gap. Could be, could be. What is? Let me ask this a different way. What is Germany and what is Japan going through, especially as we get towards the second half or latter years of the war? What are they going through that Britain and America don't really have to deal with? Yes?
Strategic bombing.
Very good. There's no bombing of the United States after Pearl Harbor. There's no bombing of London, or there's no wide-scale bombing of London after the Battle of Britain. All right, there will be some things that London has to deal with. We'll talk about rockets in a little bit, but there's no widespread threat of bombing campaigns over our countries. So our research institutions, they can work on research, and they don't have to go hide in their bomb shelters. All right, or they're not having their work destroyed by strategic bombing. And this is going to be a big advantage for the Allies. So radar. Developed in the 1930s, used to detect distant objects. It's useful in all weather, night and day, and we know it's useful in all weather because where do you guys today see radar used more than any other aspect of your lives? In weather reports, right? Yeah. So when you see the Doppler 4 radar, obviously that stuff works in big storms. That's like when it's most useful, right? So it works in all weather, and it can detect enemy aircraft, for example, coming in. This is going to be especially important in a battle like the Battle of Britain, and so here's some more ammunition that we can use, and why do the British win the Battle of Britain? When the Royal Air Force can detect German aircraft before you can see them with your naked eye. And this is huge because it allows the British Royal Air Force to stay on the ground until they get the warning that there's actual German planes coming, and then they can muster their pilots, and then they can put their planes in the sky. Why is this such an advantage for the British? Yes, sir, Darshall. Yeah, exactly, because without radar, what would you have to do? You'd have to constantly have your planes in the sky, keeping an eye on your coastline. But now they don't have to do that. So when the British planes take off, they've got a full tank of fuel. Whereas the German planes have already had to fly from Germany or northern France or Belgium to get there. So especially helpful in winning the war or the Battle of Britain. We're also going to see radar technology used on the open seas, where radar will be equipped to airplanes in what are known as air-to-surface vessel radar, ASV, air-to-surface vessel radar, to detect German submarines. Now, obviously, if the submarine is underwater, the radar is doing no good to you. But submarines don't stay underwater all the time. In fact, submarines spend a lot of their time at the surface. Or even at times when their periscope is showing. It could even be detectable by radar. That's what I read. Yeah. So anyway, it's going to be an advantage on in the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to find submarines to avoid them, try to find German U-boats to avoid them through the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. And we'll talk more about the Battle of the Atlantic in a couple minutes. Yeah?
What exactly is sonar?
We're going to get there in a second. Sonar is kind of like radar, but it's using sound waves rather than radio waves, and that's used for underwater. As the war proceeds, we also start using what are known as, it's known as HS2, or H2S, pardon me. And this is like a ground scanning radar. So Allied bombers, like a B-24 bombers, it's flying over Germany, can see what's on the ground, essentially. Now, this is not like the technology that we would be using today, or night vision or something like that, but they can actually see some topography on the ground. And it makes for more accurate bombing, especially from high altitudes or nighttime bombings. Here we have a photograph of Cologne, Germany, after a bombing run. The city's on fire here, after a bombing run by these ground scanning radars. They would also be used, just like today, by meteorologists, because weather reports can be very important to carrying out military operations. So radar, big deal during the war. Yes? Like, so, because if it's cloudy or something, you can't see what's below you, or if it's dark, you can't see what's below you, but with ground scanning radar, you can get a better picture of what's down below, so you can have more accurate strategic bombing.
So it's an aircraft.
It's an aircraft, looking at the ground. Yes, sir?
Would that help if, like, during blackouts, so, like...
Sure,
not
absolutely.
But, like, the whole, like, everybody turns off...
Absolutely.
That was a thing, right?
Yeah,
So,
because radar's not picking up light.
Yeah,
It's picking up returning radio waves. Yeah.
so that would allow them to bomb cities, fight them off.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. Obviously, the Allies aren't the only ones with radar technology, so there also needs to be a development of anti-radar devices. This, like, confetti-looking, these tiny, thin, confetti-looking metal strips, it's what's known as chaff, C-H-A-F-F, or chaff, C-H-A-F-F. And airplanes, Allied planes, would carry this with them. And then you could release it behind you as you're flying along, and it would make essentially a cloud of this confetti in the sky that could interrupt or interfere with or send back garbled signals to enemy radar. So maybe they wouldn't see you, or maybe they wouldn't be able to detect that you were 1, 2, 10 planes, it might just look like a big blob of a mess. So, yes, sir. Yeah, little metal strips. Chaff or chaff, C-H-A-F-F. The Allies would also employ jamming technology, jammers, where these would be equipped on the planes themselves. And as the planes would fly along, knowing that enemy radar is coming in, you would send a jamming signal out. And that would interfere, if it was on the same radio frequency, would interfere with the enemy radar. You guys, I don't know if any of you ever heard of a guy named Bob Marley. Are you too young? Bob Marley, a big reggae singer, right? Well, Bob Marley in the Second World War was a young man who actually, because he was from Jamaica, and Jamaica was part of the British Commonwealth, and he gets connected, and he ultimately joins the Royal Air Force, and he worked on Royal Air Force bombers, and he operated jamming devices. And as he was doing this, he started to get, because he's a musical guy, starts to get a little tune in his head, and as he's flying along, he's just kind of humming along, jamming radar all through the night, I be jamming. And then like 20 years later, he would actually make the song, We Be Jammin', about just having a good old time. But now you know the origins of that. Maggie, you don't believe me? No, that's not true. No, that's ridiculous. No. I know, don't they? But it's so unbelievable. I don't even think Bob Marley was like 5 when World War II happened. He was a young guy. Did anybody write Bob Marley down in their notes? No? All right. Anyway, yeah, that's fake. I don't know what Bob Marley was doing during World War II, but I know he wasn't on Royal Air Force planes jamming radar. All right. We move on. This is the infamous German encryption and decryption device known as the Enigma. E-N-I-G-M-A. Yes, if you have seen in the last year the Imitation Game, it's all about the people, in particular the man, that cracked this machine. Hey. Absolutely. Yep. Safe. Gotta go. So this is the Enigma machine. Mr. Spear, sir. This is the Enigma machine. Oh, come on now. How old are we? All right. Okay, then it's appropriate then. All right, so this is the Enigma machine. The Enigma machine was an encryption device. When I say encryption, I mean we can take a message that we want to send to somebody, but we don't want anyone else to read it, so we have to like jumble the letters up in some way. And people have been doing this for as long as people have wanted to keep secrets from others. All right, you guys did it as little kids. You would make little codes. Or you remember Ralphie, when he finally got his little Orphan Annie decoder ring, and he figured out his mystery message, and he was told that he needed to be sure to drink his Ovaltine. That's an encryption device, and his little Orphan Annie decoder ring that's an encryption, a cipher, and his little Orphan Annie decoder ring decrypted that. This is that same idea, just to the most advanced scale that mankind had ever devised. It was, yes, sir? Was it Alan Turing that really broke it? He was a part of the team, and he was a big part to play, but there was a lot of people involved. So the Enigma machine was actually invented in the 1930s. I'm going to give you a little background here. It was actually invented in the 1930s by a German businessman who just wanted to encrypt business secrets, essentially, to share information with people in his industry. Eventually, the German government gets wind of it and buys it and starts using it for its own diplomatic and military secrets. Before the war, the Poles had actually pretty much broken an early encryption or an early Enigma machine. And before Poland got invaded, they shared that information with the British. So the British had a little bit of a leg up on trying to figure out this monster and how to break the device. And ultimately the device will be broken. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about how it actually works, because it's really ingenious. So we've got a keyboard. It looks like a keyboard, right? And it's pretty much the same as your QWERTY keyboards, although there's a couple keys that are out of place. But I imagine it looks like every QWERTY keyboard in Germany in 1930s, 1940s. So it's got a regular keyboard with regular keys that you could push like a typewriter. And within the machine, there's a series of wires, all right? And every letter that you would push has a wire that will escape from that letter down into the machine and eventually make its way up to a second set of letters that are all illuminated. So when you push the letter X, it'll go through its wires, it'll make its way through these rotors, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then it'll make it through some other letter. That wire's connection will lead you to, I don't know, an S. So when you push an X, an S is spit out. So if you have to send a message and you're talking about the most recent X-Men movie, and you type the letter X, it's going to pump out an S for you. And so your cipher, your encrypted message, is now going to start with an S rather than an X. All right? And now you guys have done stuff like this as little kids. You know you can turn E's to S's and S's to T's and T's to R's. You've done this before. But this is far more complex than that, because that's just mixing like one letter for one letter. And we know a lot of things about the English language. We know which letters are more common in the English language. Like, you know, if you see a lot of like V's popping up, it ain't really a V. Maybe the V's are T's, you know? Or if you figured out an N and a G, you might be able to assume that the letter before it is an I, and you can build off from there, right? So obviously the Germans that put this together understand that. So there's a lot more permutations that can happen in here. Every Enigma machine can be popped open, and these rotors can all be interchanged and removed with each other. And we see two more down the side here. Most Enigma machines, initially Enigma machines had 3 rotors, then they're going to have 5, and eventually they'll have as many as 7 or 8 rotors. And each rotor is numbered. And within each, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, say. And then within each rotor, you're going to have 26 numbers, or 26 letters, all right? So from there, you can put the rotor, you can pop this baby open and put those rotors in any configuration that you are told to do. So if you have the rotor set up like rotor 1, rotor 2, rotor 3, and set all those rotors at AAA, let's call that like a baseline setting. So every Enigma machine in the world, if it were set to 1, 2, 3, and AAA, if I push the letter A, they will all spit back the exact same thing. I don't know what, maybe a C. Who knows? All right? But you wouldn't always set your Enigma like that. Every day there'll be a different key with which how you set your Enigma. So maybe today we set it 1, 2, 3. Maybe tomorrow we set it 3, 2, 1. Maybe the next day we set it 4, 3, 1. Okay, and you can arrange these in any way you want. And then maybe we don't start all the rotors at letter A. Maybe we start one at letter B, and one at letter Z, and one at letter W. And so you would have no idea where this cipher begins unless you know the key and how it's put together. But then we get even crazier, because at the front of the Enigma machine is what's known as the Stecker board or a plug board, where you've got little wires, kind of like speaker cables, speaker wires. And you can connect, for example, the Q and the R. And if I connect a cable between Q and R, what was once Q, what would be spit out when I push the letter Q, is now swapped with what is now the R. And the R is now swapped with Q. And then I could put another plug, and I could put up to 6 of these plugs into the board. So when you figure out all the possible permutations of what like one letter could be and all the different wiring routings that you could go through, oh, we also have to remember this too. One thing I didn't say. When I push the R, cool, maybe the Z lights up. But also when I push the R, this rotor turns one space. So now R doesn't have the same connection that it used to. Now if I push R again, it gives me a different letter. If I push R again, it gives me a different letter. If I get push, so you can't just say, oh wow, there's a lot of R's in this, that must be the E. No, you can't do that. So every time I push this thing, it reconfigures itself and it moves this rotor. And after this rotor moves 26 times to get through the alphabet, this rotor moves once. And then after this rotor moves another 26 times, this rotor moves again, once. And then after all those rotors move, this rotor will move once. So in the end, through all the different permutations of the rotor placements and the letters that you're starting the rotors out, we end up with 159 million possible permutations of this device. Which is that is a number so massive we can't even fathom it, but it is more than the amount of atoms in the universe. What? Like, it's ridiculous. It's crazy big. All right? So it is nothing that like a normal individual can mess with. Nothing that a normal individual can tinker with. Now, I said over the last few weeks, I'm working with my brother trying to find a time where he can show us his Enigma machine. And unfortunately, we haven't worked out a good time yet. So, what's that? Yeah. And I hope we'll still be able to figure it out, but it just hasn't happened yet. Even if it's a few weeks down the road, it doesn't matter. So I brought in my Enigma machine, and I want to show you how this works. Is that cool? All right, it's very delicate, though. All right, and we got to be very careful with this. You buy it on the App Store? All right, so I'm going to put it under the projector here, and I want to leave this over here so you can maybe see the screen. There we go, and I don't know how well this is going to show up, certainly not very well. So this is an Enigma machine app. There are a number of Enigma machine apps, and they work. This is the best one. It's the one you have to pay a couple bucks for. You have to pay a little bit for it. I want to restart. How do I restart? Your text. Very good. So what I've got is my Enigma machine here. You can't really make it out too well, but it works pretty much the exact same way the actual Enigma works. When my brother will get to talk to you, he's gonna let you know that one of the ways that he knew that the Enigma machine that he was actually buying worked is because he set up the real Enigma machine the same way his Enigma machine was set up, and he could decode a message with it. So lo and behold, it actually works. So this works like the real deal. So you've got your rotors in here, and you can swap those rotors out and rotate them any way you want, and you can start them at whatever letter. And I'm started right now at just letter AAA. You've got your regular keyboard here, set up in the exact same way of the real Enigma machine, and then you've got your lighted boards. And then you've also got the plug boards that you can get access to. And so I could set various plugs, and I can connect these, and I can add another plug if I wanted to. There we go. And it's really fun if you want a good way to send secret messages that nobody short of Alan Turing can crack, or someone else that has the app can crack. But they can only crack it. What do you need in order to crack the code? I need to know how this is set up. I need to know where to put my rotors. I need to know where to start my rotors. And then you can start sending your messages. So that's a lot of fun, right? That's a lot of fun. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to push just any old letter. I'm going to push W's. And as I type a lot of W's, we see new letters being put on, right? Very cool, yeah. It's like one of the best encryption devices ever. But the Germans said it was an impenetrable device. The Germans believed that it couldn't be broken. And here, what do we say? Like when we learn Greek mythology, we learn a lot about hubris, right? And pride coming before the fall, right? My daughter is dressed up like little Rose from the Titanic, riding that ship that was deemed unsinkable, and it sunk. And the Enigma code was unbreakable, and it was broken. So what example does that give us for things that we say are whatever? We can probably do it. Yeah, it's pretty darn close. I couldn't do it. You guys probably on your own couldn't do it. Maybe some of you could. But we ultimately did it. Because as we started working with the Enigma machine and with the original research that the Poles had worked on, and then some of the brightest minds in England, working out of a place called Bletchley Park. You should be familiar with that phrase, Bletchley Park in England. If you've seen The Imitation Game, you've seen this place. Bletchley Park, Bletchley. Bletchley Park. The mathematicians and the code breakers at Bletchley Park, as they started to play with this machine, because they had them. Okay, we had Enigma machines. That was one advantage. The Enigma machine is at one time an encoding device and a decoding device. The way, like when you get an Enigma message, or if I want to send a message encrypted to you, I have to have an Enigma machine. And I have to have my real text that I want to encipher. And I type it into the machine, and I record all these letters that are spit back to me. And then I get on my Morse code, and I dash that all the way over to you. And I know that the Allies are going to receive that same Morse code message. And they're going to read that Morse code message. And they're going to have all these letters. But I believe, as a German that believes that this machine is unbreakable, I believe that this is indecipherable. That there's nobody anywhere that can figure out how to crack this, because there's 159 million ways that this machine could be set up. all right, and could spit back messages. So I believe that's impenetrable. On the other end of my message is going to be another individual with another Enigma machine. And then they take this gibberish, and as long as my machine is set up in the identical way that the first machine was set up, and we have a daily key that tells us how to set these things up, as long as my machine's set up in the same way, if I type in this gibberish, guess what it gives me? www. If I were, I'm not going to do it right now because it takes a while to set it back up. But if I, well, maybe I could do it. Might be boring for the people. Nah, you know what? I didn't start it all at AA. If I were to have started at AA, and then if I were to reset it to the original settings, like move these rotors back to where they belong, and type in this gibberish, it's going to give me www. So it goes both ways. So you have to have an Enigma machine at the front end and the back end. Well, we had Enigma machines that we could play with. We had 2 of them. We had many of them. Because every time you would capture a German U-boat, you'd get an Enigma machine. Every time you would like overrun German positions and take over some headquarter tent or something like this, or office, you might get an Enigma machine. We had a lot of these. So you could play with them and see how they work. And ultimately, as we worked with them, we saw that there were some flaws. For example, how does this look different from your keyboard? Well, yeah, the letters are in a little bit different order, but besides that. What does it not have that your keyboards have? There's no space key. Word spaces. There's no space key in this. So whenever the Germans wanted a space, they would type the letter X. Okay, well then that can help us out a little bit. And then notice here, I typed in a bunch of W's, and I'm going to keep on typing some W's. I don't know, it's not letting me type more W's right now. My bad, I'm typing the light. That shouldn't work. I would never have done that on the real Enigma machine. I'm typing W's. And look at what is spit out. Look at the ciphertext. Okay, yeah, it's chunking these letters into chunks of 5. But what is not popping up in my ciphertext? Not the letter X. There's no W. Yeah. We learned when we played with this that one key flaw of this device is that because this is completing circuits, a W never ends up being circuited back to a W. A W won't give you a W. Now, this isn't a big clue, but it's a clue that is built upon, and it is going to help the guys that end up cracking this code to figure out how to build from that. So when you know that a W can never be a W, or a T can never be a T, that can help you work it out. Ultimately, the best way to crack this device is to figure out the way that the machine is set up every day. And finding out these keys was ultimately key. And fortunately, guys sometimes use... The number one reason companies get hacked into today is not just because of bad security on the company's part. Typically, it's us. It's human error. It's us having bad passwords. It's us, my password is password or something like this. It's us giving away information that we might inadvertently give away. Why do I ever need to find out which Gilmore Girl I am on Facebook? But you do these all the time, right? You answer these little quizzes so you can find out which character you are. And maybe they're totally innocuous. They're always stupid. Maybe they're totally innocuous. Or maybe there's somebody fishing, with a PH, fishing for information from you. And maybe they want to find out your personality, to find out which Gilmore Girl you are most like. I don't even know if I'm saying that, like, there are Gilmore Girls. I know there's a show. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if it's... Okay, it's old. This is now too old. Gosh, I'm so out of touch. But anyway, my point is, it's not that old, Maggie. I'm pretty in touch. All right. In order to find out what kind of Gilmore Girl I might be, I have to answer a series of questions, and maybe one of them is totally innocuous, like, do you have a pet? Oh, yeah, I have a dog. That totally makes me like a Gilmore Girl. What's that dog's name? Oh, it's Sparky. And now you've given some like nefarious bad guy one of the key pieces of information that could unlock your password for a bank. Don't play those stupid games. But anyway, we go back to the Enigma machine. And if we then put some of the most brilliant minds, in the world who are working in England at this Bletchley Park facility, working to crack these codes, they ultimately do it. It's a machine that makes the codes, so it's got to be a machine that cracks the codes. This is Alan Turing. He's like the star character of the Imitation Game. He was one of the leads in ultimately building the device that would crack the Enigma code. This is known as the bombe, B-O-M-B-E. That's what computers used to look like. The bombe was ultimately what they used at Bletchley Park to help do all of the calculations that the human couldn't possibly do fast enough to figure out what these encryptions actually were. And relatively early in the war, we broke the Enigma code, so this is a huge deal. In one of the tragic stories surrounding this, though, and just maybe a commentary on society, Alan Turing, despite being a guy that Winston Churchill himself would say won the Second World War 2 years probably before it would have been won militarily because of his work. So Winston Churchill said single-handedly, like if you got to find one guy most responsible for victory in this war, Churchill pointed at him. But unfortunately for him, by the early 1950s, he was accused of indecency for homosexual activity, which was against the law in England at the time. He was sentenced to either prison or chemical castration, which sounds like almost like a medieval punishment that someone would go through. He chose the latter, and then just through a fit of depression, ended up eating a cyanide-laced apple and committing suicide. Like one of the, not even, there's an argument, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, and one of the guys that Winston Churchill credited with winning the Second World War far faster than it could have ever been done without him there. And we destroyed him. Yeah.
The Queen, within like the last 5 or 10 years,
It's like 2
united.
years ago.
Like, oh really? Okay, excellent.
And he was pardoned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Like,
little too late, but still important. Listen to this, guys, from a British captain, Jerry Roberts, who worked at Bletchley Park alongside Alan Turing. He says, "You have to understand the measure of what Turing did. Early in the war in 1939, he had broken Enigma used by the Luftwaffe in the German army, but he'd been unable to break the naval Enigma. In 1940 and 41, the German U-boats were sinking our food ships and our ships bringing armaments left and right. And there was nothing to stop it until Turing managed to break the naval Enigma, as used by the U-boats. We then knew where the U-boats were positioned in the Atlantic, and our convoys could avoid them. If that hadn't happened, it is entirely possible, even probable, that Britain would have been starved and would have lost the war." So, huge deal. Huge deal. And this is where we have to step back and remember that there are incredibly strong and incredibly brave men that fight these wars. But there's a lot of guys behind the scenes that, and maybe they can't, carry a 60-pound backpack. So this is some promise to my nerds of UAIS. Maybe they can't carry a 60 or 80-pound bundle of equipment around Europe with them. But they can put their minds to work, and that can be every bit as important or even more important to an effort like the Second World War. Interesting end note to the Enigma story. The fact that the code was broken was kept a secret. This was of the utmost secrecy by the British and the American government. So Germany, Adolf Hitler on his dying day, obviously knew he lost the war. But he had no idea that we were reading his messages, or we were reading German army messages for the previous 6 years. So Adolf Hitler would never know. And then the Cold War comes along. And Great Britain shrewdly gobbled up all of the Enigma machines that it came across. And it kept these. And it said, "Hey, India, beloved colony, why don't you guys take some of these Enigma machines and use them? They're totally like the best encryption device ever. We can't figure it out, so use them." And then India starts using Enigma machines. And then in 1947, India and Pakistan break up. Now Pakistan's got some Enigma machines, and so does India. And they're now sharing secrets within Pakistan or within India. And who's reading it all? The East German government, and the East German secret police, a group known as the Stasi, they use Enigma machines through the first couple decades of the Cold War. Still using, having no clue that the Allies had broken that device. It wouldn't be declassified until the mid-1970s. Yes.
Russians didn't find out about that.
This was hush hush.
That's like the one secret that they didn't find out.
Yeah, there you go. So it would be up until the mid-70s that the Enigma machine, and here's another one of those examples of how history can change. If you're reading history books about why World War I was won in the 1960s or in the 1970s, you are likely not reading anything about the Allied breaking of the Enigma code, because nobody knew about it. And then it's unearthed, and we have to now write a bunch of new books that include this guy in it, right? So our understanding of why history happens, or it can dramatically change when information becomes declassified. 1974. Yeah, not until the 1970s. Yeah.
I'm still sort of confused. Is the Enigma machine the actual thing that breaks the code, or is it that creates the code?
The Enigma machine creates the code, but then can also decipher the code as long as you know how to set it up. The bomb, which is this thing, the bomb, which is this device, is what the Allies, who didn't always know exactly what the key was, this is how they ultimately broke the Enigma code, how they figured out how it would be set up and what the Enigma machine was trying to say. So once we've broken this, now we know where the U-boats are, now we know where German positions are. Now you can never be too good with it. Sometimes you got to let some merchant ships get sunk, right? Like if you start finding every German U-boat and sinking it, what will the Germans ultimately figure out? We cracked the code. So unfortunately, you can't be too good, or the Germans will stop using the code altogether. All right, everybody good?
Broken in 1971.
No, it was broken in 1939, 40, and like, the Germans would continue to change it. But declassified not until the 70s, 74. Yeah.
So you said like the code changed like every day.
The way you set up your machine would change. Yeah.
So how did the other Germans know how to like set it up?
So the way to set up the code, the way to set up the machine, would actually be within the code that was being sent. So when you would get the code sent to you, like the first characters of that code would lead you to a key book and would tell you then, according to those letters, how to set up that machine for that particular day. All right? So the book was very important. The book was very important. All right. Well, they would change too. You wouldn't. They would be issued at different times. So you'd have some, and sometimes they'd be useless. All right, we're going to move on to different technologies. Going to talk about the naval war. We've already handled some of this. World War II is the war of on the open seas. It's the war of aircraft carriers. If we were to classify World War I as a particular kind of ship on the open seas, what would the preeminent ship in World War I be? Battleships. Now, that's kind of weird, though, because that was what it was supposed to be. Like, when you went to the previews or when you saw the trailers for what World War I was supposed to be, it was supposed to be a battleship war, where the British had developed their Dreadnought-class battleships, and the Germans had matched the British, and they were each having this naval race to develop a bigger and nastier navy. And then World War I came, and what happened?
There's only one naval battle.
Yeah, we've only got one major naval battle, surface naval battle. The Germans can't escape out of the North Sea. So the battleship war that everybody predicted never came to fruition. In the Second World War, battleships would still be there, but they would be trumped by aircraft carriers. Because the reach of an aircraft carrier can reach far beyond the ability of German or American guns on battleships or Japanese guns on battleships to fire. So for example, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, one of the first major naval engagements of the Second World War, this is in May of 1942. Our Navy never actually saw, our ships never actually saw the Japanese ships. But our planes from our aircraft carriers would attack the Japanese fleet. And the Japanese planes would come to get our fleet. And ultimately, we were victorious in this. And we stopped the continuing advance of the Japanese Navy. In the next month, we've got the Battle of Midway. We already talked about that. This is seen as the turning point battle in the Pacific War, where the American Navy sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. This is a tremendous blow to the Japanese Navy. At the start of World War II, Japan had 10 aircraft carriers. The United States had 6. But during the war, Japan would only be able to build 4 additional aircraft carriers, while the United States built 17 more. So when Japan loses 4 in the Battle of Midway, it's a devastating blow that is irreplaceable. Not to mention the hundreds of airplanes that are being lost in these fights as well.
Especially the skilled airmen and like ground crew.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Everything.
All good? Good. Yes, Darshan. Oh gosh, how many hundred?
A few hundred.
Yeah, okay. Because they can be below decks too, and there's elevators and such. Yeah.
To clarify, was that the Royal Sea in World War II?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. All this is World War II. All right. When people think about war, especially in the Pacific, or pardon me, in the Atlantic, we think about submarine warfare. But I want to call a timeout for a second. Because the Germans weren't the only dastardly people using submarines to sink merchant ships. We were sinking plenty of Japanese merchant ships with our submarines in the Pacific. And this is devastating to the Japanese economy and ability to keep fighting the war. So this is one of those stories about like how we tell the story of our wars tells a lot about who we are or how we feel about ourselves. We talk a lot about German U-boats sinking merchant ships and how that is just despicable during the First and Second World War. Well, we are playing every bit the same part in the Second World War to Japanese merchant ships in the Pacific. Now, let's see how bright we are, see how good we are with understanding how World War II works. Why aren't we sinking a bunch of German merchant ships in the Atlantic? Yeah. No one, yeah, Germany's got where would stuff be coming from? That's why Hitler needed the Lebensraum. He was getting it all from land resources, right? So Germany wasn't bringing in a lot of shipments from anywhere else. But Japan certainly was sending shipments from the empire they created to the mainland. So the United States employed our submarine fleet primarily in the Pacific, while in the Atlantic, the Germans are using their U-boats, German submarines, to strike at Allied shipping in what is known as the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic is the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. And essentially it starts at the beginning of the Second World War and it ends with the Second World War. So like the entire duration of the war is essentially the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats are trying to sink Allied merchant vessels. And Allied navies are trying to find German U-boats. U-boats are very successful in sinking Allied merchant vessels. And you guys can see these two charts. The green one, these are the numbers and don't worry about the raw numbers here because we'll never memorize them. But they're sinking massive amounts of merchant ships. And at the same time, we're going to get better and better at sinking U-boats. But one thing that we can do that the Germans can't do is we are building ships as we've never built before. We can replace sunken merchant vessels, whereas the Germans can't as easily replace lost U-boats. Why do we get so good at sinking U-boats? First, the breaking of the naval Enigma code. That's big. And yes, sir?
We start making convoys with like destroyer escorts so you can detect and sink submarines before they attack.
Very good. We start using what's called a convoy system, where merchant vessels will be flanked by warships. And the warships can protect the merchant vessels from enemy submarines. So if a submarine ever shows itself, then they can be destroyed. Yes?
Why can't they just like put the supplies on the
Well, because the warships are carrying, like, these are big cargo ships that are like full of cargo. Warships are full of sailors and ammunition and artillery rounds and planes and yeah, and the warships are being targeted too. But submarines don't like to play with warships quite as much because they can destroy themselves, or they can be destroyed by them. We also developed sonar technology during World War II, so here's answering your question from earlier. Sonar is essentially radar underwater, except it's using sound waves rather than radio waves. So a naval vessel will send sound waves into the sea, and those sound waves will bounce off of a big hunk of metal back to your detector. So you can see where the bad guys are. Eventually, U-boat losses will be unsustainable for Germany, and Germany will lose the Battle of the Atlantic. Good? Good. World War II also gives birth to rocket technology. This is an American soldier firing a bazooka, or two guys firing bazookas. These are shoulder-fired rockets that were used against tanks, for example. Not hugely impactful on the war, more so on the Pacific theater because the Japanese tanks weren't as heavily armored. But if you want to hear more about that, there's your guy. All right? But what I think is more consequential for us is what the Germans were up to with rocket technology. This is a German V2 rocket, V2.
Launched into Britain, right?
Well, they were used in a lot of places. The German V2 rocket is the world's first ballistic missile. The first deployed ballistic missile. A ballistic is anything that goes from here to there, right? Like a cannonball is a ballistic. You guys are in physics, some of you. You probably talk about ballistics, right? No? Man, don't they do anything fun in the school? No, you don't get to shoot anything? What? You're right. Anyway, this is not going to be very consequential to the outcome of World War II, obviously, because the Germans developed it, and what happens to Germany in World War II? They lose. And in fact, it is such a costly endeavor to develop these, not only in financial expense, like the Germans spend more developing the V2 than we spend developing the atomic bomb.
Like proportionally, or
Like dollar-wise. So that and the amount of fuel that the V2 program had to use was hugely costly to the German home front. They were making much of the fuel for the V2 rocket from potatoes. Now you're going to scoff, but we make gasoline out of corn, so get over it, okay? So they're making fuel from potatoes. Well, what use do potatoes have in war besides making fuel out of them? Yeah, you've got starving people at home. So this is problematic. So the V2 is ultimately not going to tip any balance of the war towards the Germans. In fact, it might impede research in other areas. But it will be a sign of things to come. Because one of the chief engineers behind this, just hear his name, you don't need to write it down, is a guy named Wernher von Braun. If you guys ever remember seeing the movie, a great movie called Rocket Boys back in the day, with a young Jake Gyllenhaal, you remember that one? Yeah, all right. Well, his big thing is he wanted to win the rocket competition so he could win a scholarship and go meet Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun is the German rocket scientist after the war. Rather than being put up on like war crimes or anything, he was allowed with other German scientists to come to the United States. And we set up shop for him in Huntsville, Alabama. And they started working on America's rocket programs. Rockets that would eventually launch a guy to the moon, or guys to the moon. Yeah?
Do we have to know the dude's name?
No, just hear it, that's fine. Good? Good. Good. Kevin? 50% more for the V2 program than the U.S. spent on Manhattan Project. Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Yours thinks as well.
We would also have the development. During the Second World War of jet aircraft, jet propulsion aircraft, rather than propellered aircraft. This is going to be towards the end of the war. This is a German plane here. Not a huge impact on the war. The Germans will have faster and more maneuverable jet aircraft than the Allies will. But what they can't do is produce them as fast as us and produce as many as us. But this is, again, another sign of things to come. Like our fighter aircraft today. We don't have fighter aircraft that use propellers. They're slow. So it's all jet-based today, and so that's where the technology starts. So if you want to think of World War I like introducing airplanes and introducing tanks to warfare, World War II introduces rockets and missiles and jet aircraft to warfare. Yes, sir?
It could have had a pretty big impact on the war, but the problem was, again, that the Germans were really inefficient in like their R&D and their production, because they were spending money on other like advanced aircraft, like they had something called the Comet, which was using like a rocket to propel the aircraft.
Okay.
And if they were like concentrating all their resources into this, then they could have made a lot more of them.
Okay.
And it could have made a big impact on
Spreading themselves a little thin here.
Yeah.
Cool. Next to talk about is a letter. It's a letter in 1939 from Albert Einstein to Franklin Roosevelt, where Albert Einstein, pretty prominent figure, right? You've all heard of him. Albert Einstein is going to write Franklin Roosevelt and tell him about some research that's being done about splitting the atom or splitting the nucleus of a uranium atom, and about the possible military use for such scientific research. Like, this can release a lot of energy, which can make a terrible explosion, and that we need to work on this because others are working on it. And pushed by this letter, Franklin Roosevelt will begin or call for the beginning of what is known as the Manhattan Project. This guy on the left here is Robert Oppenheimer. He'll be the scientific director for the Manhattan Project. And it will become the biggest government operation during the Second World War to develop the atomic bomb. By 1945, we have 130,000 people employed working on the development of an atomic bomb. Most of them had no clue what they were actually working on. Most of them knew they were doing something and knew it was for the military, but had no idea that the end result was an atomic bomb. Secrecy was of the utmost importance. We see this sign. This is outside of Tennessee. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. We don't want anybody talking about what's going on or what kind of work they're doing. It has to be of the utmost secrecy. Unfortunately, despite our efforts to keep it secret, the Soviets still infiltrated our Manhattan Project. So in July of 1945, when we actually detonate a test bomb called Trinity in the desert of New Mexico, and President Harry Truman, who's at a big meeting in Germany called Potsdam, when he's at the Potsdam Conference and he's given news that we've got this weapon, and he shares this information with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, Joseph Stalin has to feign surprise because he already knew what we were doing, and he already knew that we had developed, or we were close to developing this bomb. And it's because of the Soviet spies of the Manhattan Project that they themselves will, by 1949, develop a bomb quite similar to what we had already been working on. But that's another story. We developed the atomic bombs. We're the only country, obviously, to do it during the war, and then we use it to end the war more quickly with Japan. We've already talked about these things. We don't need to go any further with that. Good? Good. Yeah?
Do you by chance know what Einstein thought of using the bomb?
Did he say he's done like the worst thing ever?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
said that he didn't like it afterwards.
Yeah, a lot of these guys. Not all of them, but a lot. Like Oppenheimer is a guy that, after it was all said and done, showed a lot of regret towards where we went. This is a tough one to wrap your head around, because I think there's a lot of different ways to think about it. I think you've got also, there's one school of thought that says, you know, as tragic as it was that we used the bombs, using them ultimately, like, or at least using them by us and having us like the first ones that had them, might have prevented them ever to be used again, because they were seeing what they could do, and it made everybody far more cautious about using anything like that in the future. So the fact that we in the Soviet Union would eventually develop thousands upon thousands of nuclear warheads, neither of us ever used them. And maybe we didn't use them because we saw really what they could do. Maybe. I don't know. So whatever helps them sleep at night. We press on a little bit more. Maybe one of the most important technological advancements of the United States during the war effort was the ability to convert our nation to a nation of, or to an industrial war machine. President Roosevelt called this, or called the United States, for us to be the arsenal of democracy, that we need to produce the weapons of war to win this war. And with that, the United States government would create what's known as the War Productions Board. The War Productions Board, to oversee and orchestrate the conversion of a civilian economy to a wartime economy. And guys, we have to wrap our heads around our country that is like proud of its capitalist heritage, right? And its free and democratic nature. World War II is a time where the US federal government stepped up and essentially told businesses, private industries, what they needed to do, what they could do, and what they couldn't do. And because everybody was so behind this war effort, the businesses listened. And of course, they're going to make a hefty profit off of the federal government with these contracts as well. By 1942, all American auto companies had to convert to military production. So you won't see, for example, in 1943, there are no civilian production vehicles whatsoever. You can't buy a 1943 Ford or a 1943 GM or a 1943 Buick or Dodge. They don't exist. Because in 1943, these companies were all making these things. This is a photo of the Ford Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. You might have seen in the news last week where like 2,000 Rosie the Riveters went to Willow Run dressed up like the Rosie the Riveter character and again reclaimed the title in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most Rosie the Riveters in a picture, which is an award. It's a record.
What was the name of the committee?
The War Productions Board. So the Willow Run plant would make B-24 bombers, assembling 500,000 parts and 300,000 rivets per each one. And by the end of a month, at its peak, they were producing 650 of these a month. This is production that no other country could compete with. Our shipbuilding industry is no different. This is how you put a submarine in the water after you build it. I know, it's kind of crazy, right? You're not sinking it, you're just dropping it in and it'll float. We begin to mass produce ships like we had never done before. In the decade of the 1930s, the United States Navy had called for the building of 23 warships. During the Second World War, from 1941 to 45, we built over 4,500 warships. Now, most of those are like landing craft, like the things we saw, like the Higgins boats taking guys onto D-Day, right? So they're not all big battleships or aircraft carriers, to be sure. But we can produce the weapons of war, whether they be aircraft or trucks or tanks or ships, like no other country could. Almost done here, guys. Hang. Yes, ma'am.
So is the Washington Naval Conference kind of like...
That's done. Yeah, that's over. The Washington Naval, her question, good. Back in 1921, do you guys remember the Washington Naval Conference that put some limits on battleship production? That is blown out of the water by the 1930s. Remember the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935 that allowed Germany to violate the Washington Naval Conference, essentially? Yeah. And I think the Washington Naval Conference anyway had a 10-year sunset on it. It was only a 10-year thing. So anyway, rubber. Something that maybe you wouldn't think about in terms of fighting a war. Like we think of bullets and steel maybe, but we don't think of rubber. But every truck and every tank and every Jeep and every airplane uses a lot of rubber. Whether it be for tread, for their tires, or they're for the hundreds of gaskets and things that would be inside these engines. Rubber is an essential commodity. But where does rubber come from? Trees. And where does most of the rubber in the world come from? And who controls Southeast Asia during the war? Japan took it over. Japan during the war controlled 90%. I know, Maggie. Maggie's like, oh my gosh, I can see why this is so problematic. Japan controls 90% of the world's rubber production by the time we get into the Second World War. So we've got a problem. One way to solve the problem is doing scrap drives. Hey, you got old tires? Now, again, I'm going to bring up a Christmas story. You know how they're driving the car and Dad's tire blows out and Dad says, and Ralphie's got to hold nuts and he spills them and he says, fudge? You guys remember this?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Tires used to pop a lot more. Today, we drive on our cars for 20, 30, 40,000 miles, sometimes more, without changing tires. They never lasted that long back in the day. So it was not uncommon for people in their garage to have spare tires and extra sets of tires and multiple tires. Well, in the Second World War, you would get rid of those, and you would turn them in. We would also be rationing rubber. There would be rubber rations during World War II, so you could only buy so many tires. So patching your tires became a pretty important deal that people would do on their own. But then we have scientists and researchers in the United States working on synthetic rubber, making fake rubber, essentially, that can do the same thing the real stuff can do, but we don't need Southeast Asia to do it. By 1944, American researchers and industry have now produced more synthetic rubber than the world was previously producing real rubber. And again, this is a production that the Axis powers can't compete with. Because what's happening to a lot of that real rubber that's making its way to Japan?
It's on the bottom of the ocean.
It's sunk by American submarines, and it's on the bottom of the ocean. They can't compete. We close with talking about some medical technology. Penicillin, the first mass-produced antibiotic. It's actually developed before the Second World War, but the Second World War is where it will become commonplace and mass-produced. By the end of the Second World War, the United States government has called for the production of 600 billion units of penicillin. So for all those guys in the First World War that were being wounded and that had their wounds getting infected, and in many cases they were dying from wounds that were not life-threatening in and of themselves, but they died from the infections that came after. Well, now we can kill those bacteria with penicillin. So a lot of guys would survive the war because Edward Jenner in 1929 developed penicillin. Not my bad. Alexander Fleming. I was seeing if you guys were listening to me. Jenner smallpox. My bad. Also, blood. We've got a lot of soldiers losing a lot of blood in the Pacific and in Europe. But blood is tough to get from point A to point B. Because it's got to be, kept at a certain temperature, right? And you've got to have a way to get it to the front lines, and that's not easy. And you got blood types. If you start giving the wrong blood to the wrong blood type, the wrong person, it can cause some serious problems for them. So in the Second World War, the United States started using blood plasma, which was dried plasma from blood, a component of blood, that can be given to soldiers suffering from blood loss, but it could be taken anywhere easily, and then combined with water and given to soldiers who would otherwise be losing too much blood. Easily transportable, and blood type didn't matter. So the United States would have blood drives during the war, not only to get blood for soldiers, but also to collect the blood plasma. I thought this picture was a joke when I first saw it. I know, it looks kind of crazy. So this is a soldier in the Pacific having an application of DDT on his body. Now DDT is a pretty sweet wrestling move from the 1980s. But it was also an insecticide, a very successful and powerful insecticide. I know, this looks kind of crazy, right? Like, what would your mom think if you were going to squeeze DDT all over yourself? I wouldn't call for it, right? Sounds pretty dangerous. It's so dangerous, in fact, that the world banned it back most of the world banned it back in the 1960s. Turns out it wasn't as dangerous as we once thought it was. And in fact, it's been deemed to not be carcinogenic. But a book was written in 1962 called Silent Spring that blamed DDT on the disappearance of beautiful songbirds. And so there was such a visceral reaction to this book that the United States banned the use of DDT. There are some people that today want to bring it back because this could do wonders to solve malaria problems in Africa, but there's still a concern about the environmental effects of it. But regardless, DDT was helpful to kill mosquitoes in Asia, and it was helpful to take care of lice and things that could cause other problems like typhus and such in the war. So we use an insecticide to help protect our guys. And finally, during the Second World War, the United States developed an ability to deliver morphine to soldiers in extreme pain or in shock while they were in the field. You guys might remember this from when we watched a little bit of Saving Private Ryan. And this is there's a little hypodermic needle in here, and you would just inject this syringe into someone's body, and you could squeeze the morphine into them and give them a quick dose of this very powerful pain reliever. And that would aid a lot of soldiers on the front lines who were suffering some of the worst injuries. So all kinds of technological advancements, some having a monumental impact on the war. Of these monumental impacts, American production, huge. Aircraft carriers, huge. Submarines, pretty massive impact. The medical technology, especially penicillin, huge, right? Others, the atomic bomb, huge. The Enigma, breaking of the Enigma machine, huge. Others, important, but for stories to come yet.